My name is Kale, and for about a year I worked the night shift at a diner off Highway 87 in Montana. I am not going to tell you the exact mile marker, and if you ever find the place on your own, you will understand why I would rather not be the one who sent you there. Most people have driven a stretch of highway like that one at some point in their life, the kind where the broken yellow line seems to repeat itself for an hour straight, and the radio starts pulling in stations from 2 states over. You get used to the emptiness. What you do not expect is for that emptiness to come with rules. 3 months before I took the job, I left Billings. I'm not going to get into what happened there. It is not really part of this story, except to say that by the time I got to Harlow, Montana, I wanted 3 things out of whatever came next. I wanted quiet. I wanted nobody asking me questions about my last address or why I left my last one. And I wanted enough distance between me and everyone I used to know that I could stop flinching every time my phone rang. Wayside Diner gave me the first 2 without any trouble at all. The third thing, it turned out, came with a cost I did not understand until much later. I found the job the way you find most jobs out in that part of the state, which is to say I found it by accident. There was a flyer stapled to a corkboard at a gas station about 60 miles outside of Harlow, one sheet of paper gone soft and curled at the corners from humidity. It said night cook and counter help wanted at Wayside Diner, cash paid weekly, no experience necessary, ask for Rowan. There was a phone number written under that in blue ink, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who has filled out a lot of forms in his life. I called that same night from a motel room with carpet the color of weak coffee. A man picked up on the second ring and told me his name was Rowan, and when I said I was interested in the job, he did not ask me anything about myself. He asked if I could start Thursday. I drove out there 2 days later in my truck, an old Ford that burned a little oil on the highway, but had gotten me the whole way from Billings without dying on me. Highway 87 runs mostly straight through that part of Garrity County, cutting between wheat fields that had already been cut for the season and long stretches of nothing but fence line and sky. You can see the diner sign from almost 3 miles out at night, a single word in red neon that says diner, nothing fancier than that, sitting alone against a horizon with no other lights around it. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. Wayside Diner looks like any other roadside place you have passed 100 times without stopping. It has a counter with stools bolted to the floor, 4 booths along the window, a pass-through window to the kitchen, and a coffee machine that has probably been there longer than I have been alive. There is nothing about the outside of that building that would make you slow down twice. That is what made the first 8 months so hard to explain to myself, because for most of that time, the job was exactly as boring as it looked. The night I want to start with is not my first night. It is a night 8 months into the job, because that is the night everything I thought I understood about the place stopped being simple. But to tell you about that night properly, I need to back up first and tell you how I got there, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I pulled into the gravel lot a little after 11 that night, same as always, tires popping over loose stone until I parked next to the propane tank at the side of the building. Through the window, I could see Callista at the register, counting out the drawer under the hanging light above the counter. Callista worked the evening shift into early night, and I came on after her most nights to cover through morning. She was maybe 30, dark hair always pulled back in a low ponytail, the kind of person who could count a drawer of 1s and 5s without once looking down at her hands. I came in through the front door, and the bell above it gave its usual small ring. Callista did not look up right away. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Figured I'd come sit here instead of at the motel." She finished stacking a pile of $5 bills and slid a rubber band around them before she looked at me. Something in her face was different that night, though I did not clock it as anything more than tiredness at the time. "You remember the rules, right?" she said. "All 5 of them." It was not really a question. Callista had asked me some version of that maybe a dozen times over the past 8 months, usually when she was closing out and I was coming on, like a habit more than anything else. But something about the way she said it that night made me stop halfway to hanging up my jacket. "Yeah," I said, "I remember." "Good," she said, and went back to counting. I did not think much of it right then. I hung my jacket on the hook by the kitchen door, same as I did every night, and I want you to understand that nothing about that moment felt like the start of anything. It felt like every other night I had worked there since the day Rowan first handed me a piece of paper with 5 rules written on it in the same blue ink from the flyer, and told me that if I followed them, I would be fine, and if I did not, he could not promise me anything at all. To understand what came after, you need to go back with me to that first day, because that is when I learned what those 5 rules actually were, and why a diner in the middle of nowhere needed them in the first place. The day I met Rowan, I drove out to Wayside Diner around noon, when the lot was empty except for one faded blue truck parked near the propane tank. The inside of the diner was quiet, sunlight coming through the front windows and landing across the counter in long strips. A man in his 50s came out from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel, tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of tired eyes that come from a lot of years of not sleeping quite enough. That was Rowan. He shook my hand, told me to sit at the counter, and asked me exactly 2 questions. He asked if I had a problem working nights alone, and he asked if I had anywhere else I needed to be. I told him no to both, which was true. "Pay is $18 an hour," he said. "Cash, every week, no paperwork beyond what the law requires of me. You keep your hours in a notebook I'll give you, and I trust you to be honest about it." $18 an hour was more than double what any other counter job in that part of the state was paying, and I noticed that right away. I asked him why the pay was so high for a job that mostly meant flipping eggs and pouring coffee for truckers at 3 in the morning. Rowan did not answer that directly. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, the same handwriting from the gas station flyer covering both sides. "Because there's a little more to the job than eggs and coffee," he said. "I need you to read this, and I need you to actually follow it. Not most of the time, all of the time." He slid the paper across to me. I unfolded it and read it twice before I said anything. The first rule said always greet or acknowledge every regular customer, especially the elderly man with pale, almost see-through skin, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. The second rule said if you ever see a man with eyes that reflect light the way an animal's eyes do, go into the walk-in freezer immediately and stay there until you are certain he has left the building. The third rule said if a woman in a blue dress walks in, do not speak to her, do not serve her, close the diner immediately, lock the door, and go home for the night. The fourth rule said never work the last shift of any month alone. There must always be 2 people on for that closing. The fifth rule said if a child comes to the diner after midnight, ignore them completely. Do not speak to them, do not serve them, do not acknowledge in any way that they are there. I read through it once, then read it again slower, waiting for Rowan to tell me it was a joke, some kind of hazing thing new employees went through. He did not laugh. He watched me read it with the patience of someone who had handed that same piece of paper to other people before me. "I'm not going to explain any of it," Rowan said. "Not because I'm trying to scare you and not because I enjoy keeping secrets. It's because I don't fully understand it myself, not the why of it, only the what. What I can tell you is that the 5 rules on that page have kept this place standing for a long time, and every single time something has gone wrong here, it's because one of those rules got broken. Not bent, broken." I asked him who wrote the rules in the first place. He told me his father, Walton, had run the diner before him, and that Walton had started writing things down in a notebook decades earlier, after things happened that he never talked about with anyone except Rowan, and only near the end of his life. Rowan said he still had that notebook in the back office, though he had not opened it in years, because there was nothing else useful in it beyond what was already condensed onto the single page in my hands. "You don't have to believe any of it today," Rowan said. "You just have to follow it. Belief comes on its own, usually faster than people want it to." He walked me through the building after that. The dining area was small, 4 booths and 6 stools at the counter. The kitchen sat behind a pass-through window, big enough for one cook to work comfortably. A hallway ran off the back of the kitchen to a supply room, a cramped office with a desk and a filing cabinet, and at the very end, a walk-in freezer with a heavy metal door and a rubber gasket seal. Rowan pointed at that door specifically. "That's Rule 2, he said. "Memorize where it is before your first night alone, because you will not want to be looking for it in the dark." He gave me a green spiral notebook for logging my hours, told me my first shift would start that Thursday at 10 in the evening, and told me one more thing before I left that day. He said the rules were simple on paper, and that the hard part was never remembering them. The hard part was doing what they said in the moment they applied, when every instinct in your body was telling you to do the opposite. I did not fully understand what he meant by that until my 3rd week on the job, on a slow Tuesday night when the bell over the door rang and nobody was standing in the parking lot outside. It was a little after 2 in the morning, and I had not had a single customer in almost 3 hours. I was wiping down the counter when the bell rang, and I looked up expecting a trucker who needed coffee to make the last stretch of his route. Instead, an old man stood just inside the door, looking at the room like he was deciding whether to stay. I want to describe him carefully, because this was the first time I understood the rules were not a joke. His skin was so pale it looked thin in the fluorescent light overhead, almost the way skin looks when you press a flashlight against your own hand in a dark room, except his did that without any flashlight at all. I could see the faint shapes of veins beneath the surface of his forearms where his sleeves were rolled up. He wore a gray coat despite the fact that it was not cold enough outside to need one, and when he smiled at me, his teeth were narrower and more pointed than any human teeth I had ever seen, though the rest of his face looked entirely ordinary, like someone's grandfather. Every part of me wanted to stare, or worse, wanted to say nothing at all and hope he would leave on his own. I thought about the piece of paper Rowan had given me 3 weeks earlier, folded now in the drawer under the register. Rule 1. Always greet or acknowledge every regular customer, especially him. "Evening," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Table or counter?" He took a seat at the far end of the counter, the same stool every single time I would come to learn later, and he said, "Counter is fine, son. Coffee, black, no sugar." I poured his coffee with a hand that was not quite steady, but I kept my voice even and asked if he wanted anything to eat. He said no, just the coffee, and thanked me by name, though I had never told him my name and had not been wearing a name tag that night. He sat there for maybe 20 minutes, drinking his coffee slowly, saying nothing else, and I busied myself restocking napkin dispensers because I did not know what else to do with my hands. When he finished, he set down exactly enough cash to cover the coffee and a generous tip, stood, nodded once in my direction, and walked out the door. I watched through the window as he crossed the empty parking lot toward the dark stretch of highway, and by the time I looked away and looked back, there was no sign of him anywhere, no headlights, no sound of a car starting. I called Callista the next afternoon before my shift, because I needed to hear from someone else that what happened had actually happened. "Old man," I said, "skin like paper, sharp teeth, ordered black coffee and didn't want anything else." "Mr. Henley," Callista said, like she was confirming an order rather than a description of something that should not exist. "You said hello and treated him normal." I said evening and asked if he wanted a table or the counter. "Then you're fine," she said. "He's harmless as long as you act like he's just another regular. He's been coming in for years, longer than me, probably longer than Rowan's been running the place alone. Just don't ever ignore him and don't ever stare too long at his hands or his teeth. That's it. That's the whole rule. I asked her what would happen if someone did stare or did ignore him. There was a pause on the line before she answered. I don't know for certain, she said. I've never seen anyone try. I've just always done what the rule says, and so far, so good. That answer did not comfort me the way I wanted it to, but it also did not scare me the way I expected. It sat somewhere in between, and for a while, that in-between feeling became the closest thing I had to normal. Mr. Henley came back every week or two after that. Always the same stool, always black coffee, always paid in exact cash before he vanished into the empty highway outside. I got used to him the way you get used to any regular customer, and for the next several months, that was the only rule I ever had reason to think about. That changed on the night I told you about at the start, 8 months into the job, the night everything else in this story actually begins. Callista left a little before midnight that night, same as she usually did once the drawer was counted and squared away for the evening. She grabbed her jacket, told me she would see me the next evening for the changeover, and walked out to her car, a gray Honda Civic parked at the far end of the lot. I watched her taillights pull out onto Highway 87 and disappear north, and then it was just me, the hum of the coffee machine, and the sound of wind pushing against the front windows. Rain had started sometime after 10 that night, not heavy, just steady enough that the highway outside had gone dark and slick, no headlights passing in either direction. I wiped down the counter, restocked the napkin holders, and settled into the kind of quiet that made the whole building feel bigger than it actually was. Around 1 in the morning, the lights in the parking lot flickered once, then steady. I did not think much of it at the time, since the power out there was never entirely reliable during storms. I went back to refilling the ketchup bottles behind the counter, and that is when I noticed the room had gone completely silent. No rain against the glass, no wind, nothing. I looked up, and a man was standing just outside the front door, close enough to the glass that I should have heard the bell if he had come in through it, except the bell had not rung at all. His clothes were unremarkable, a plain jacket, work pants, nothing that would draw a second look on its own. It was his eyes that stopped me cold. They caught the light from the parking lot sign and threw it back the way an animal's eyes do in a set of headlights, a flat, bright shine that human eyes do not produce. He was not moving, not blinking, just standing there looking through the glass directly at me. I did not think. My body remembered the rule before my mind fully caught up to what I was looking at. I turned and walked as fast as I could down the back hallway, past the office, past the supply room, until I reached the heavy metal door of the walk-in freezer. I pulled it open, stepped inside, and pulled it shut behind me, the rubber gasket sealing with a soft sucking sound that cut off almost all noise from the rest of the building. The freezer held steady around 10 degrees below zero, and within a minute my breath was fogging in front of my face, and my fingers had already started to ache from the cold. I did not know how long I would need to stay in there, and nobody had ever told me exactly how to judge when it was safe to come out. I stood among boxes of frozen hash browns and cases of ground beef, arms wrapped around myself, listening as hard as I could through the door. For a long stretch of time there was nothing to hear at all, just the low hum of the freezer's own compressor and the sound of my own breathing. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard something break in the dining room. A single sharp crack, like wood splitting. Then another a few seconds later, then a third. I stayed exactly where I was, teeth starting to chatter, counting my own heartbeat because I did not have a watch and did not dare take out my phone to check the time in case the light or the sound gave me away. I do not know exactly how long I waited in that freezer. It felt like a very long time, though I understand now it was probably closer to 20 minutes than an hour. Eventually, the silence outside the door felt different, lighter somehow, and I decided that whatever had been standing at the front door was gone. I opened the freezer door slowly, and stepped out into a hallway that felt almost warm compared to where I had been standing. I walked back toward the dining room on legs that did not feel entirely like my own, and when I reached the counter, I saw what had made the cracking sounds. 3 of the stools bolted to the floor along the counter had been snapped clean off at the base. The metal poles bent and twisted in ways that should have required tools, not bare hands. There was no broken glass, no scattered debris beyond the stools themselves, and no footprints anywhere on the tile floor, wet or otherwise, despite the rain that had been falling outside for hours. I called Rowan from the office phone, my hand still not fully steady, and told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "You did exactly right," he said. "Getting into that freezer fast is the only thing that matters with him. I'll come by in the morning to deal with the stools." I asked him, because I needed to ask somebody, what would have happened if I had not made it to the freezer in time. Rowan did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone quieter. "About 6 years back, I had a night cook named Dale working here," he said. "Good kid, reliable. One night he didn't make it to the back in time. I came in the next morning and his car was still in the lot, but he wasn't anywhere in the building or anywhere around it. Sheriff's department looked into it for a while. Eventually, they wrote it up as him walking off the job and skipping town, since there wasn't anything else to go on. I never told them different, because I didn't have anything to tell them that wouldn't have gotten me looked at instead of helped." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, in a diner that suddenly felt a great deal larger and emptier than it had 8 months of quiet shifts had led me to believe. I had left Billings looking for a place where nobody would ask about my past. I understood now that I had traded that concern for a different kind of quiet altogether, one that came with its own price, paid in full attention to 5 rules that I had until that night only half believed in. I did not know then that Mr. Henley and the man with the reflecting eyes were only the first 2 names on a list that would eventually include people, not just things standing outside a window at night. About 7 weeks after that storm, Rowan hired a second night worker to help cover the early morning stretch of shifts, a stretch that ran from about 4 in the morning until the diner opened properly for the daytime cook at 7. His name was Brian, 23 years old, the kind of person who talked easily to strangers and had an opinion about almost everything, including the rules, which he treated as an odd company policy rather than anything he actually believed. "Man, a diner with a list of house rules about ghosts," Brian said to me during his second week, leaning against the counter while I restocked coffee filters. "Rowan's messing with us, testing how far new hires will go along with something before they push back." I told him I had seen enough by then to know it was not a joke, but Brian laughed it off the way people do when they have not yet had their own reason to stop laughing. I did not push it further that night. Some things I had already learned, people needed to see for themselves. The morning it happened, I was still on shift, about 20 minutes before Brian usually showed up to take over. It was just before 4, the sky outside still fully dark, when the bell over the door rang and a woman walked in wearing a simple blue dress, the kind you might see on someone heading to a summer barbecue rather than standing on an empty highway before dawn. She looked at first glance entirely ordinary, mid-30s maybe, hair down, an easy smile already forming as she looked around the room. I felt my whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Rule 3, do not speak to her, do not serve her, close the diner and go home. I did not say a word. I moved toward the register as calmly as I could manage, intending to grab the notebook Rowan kept for logging closures, when the front door opened again and Brian walked in for his shift, right on time, completely unaware of what was already standing 3 feet inside the door. "Morning," Brian said easily, the way he greeted every customer, looking at the woman with the same friendly, automatic politeness he gave everyone. The woman turned toward him and smiled, and her voice, when she spoke, was calm and pleasant in a way that made the whole moment feel almost normal. "I think I might be a little lost," she said. "Would you happen to know how far it is to the next town from here?" I watched Brian start to answer her, his mouth already opening, his body relaxing into the kind of casual conversation he had 100 times with truckers and travelers, and something in me understood that if he finished that sentence, whatever came next would not be something either of us could undo. I crossed the room fast and grabbed his arm hard enough that he flinched, cutting him off mid-word. "We're closing," I said, loud enough that it filled the whole room, not looking at the woman at all. "Sorry, ma'am, we're closing right now." I do not fully know what my face looked like in that moment, but Brian's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm, and to his credit, he did not argue with me. I pulled him behind the counter with me, flipped the light switch by the register, and the dining room dropped into a dim half-dark lit only by the parking lot sign outside. I did not look at the woman again. I heard the bell over the door ring once as she left, though I never saw which direction she walked, because I refused to look toward the window. We locked the front door, grabbed our jackets, and left through the back, getting into our separate cars without discussing it, driving away from that parking lot faster than either of our vehicles were really built for. Brian called me later that same day, his voice different than I had ever heard it, quiet or careful. "What was that?" he said. "What was actually happening back there?" I told him about the rules again, the same way Rowan had told me, without trying to explain the why of any of it, only the what. Brian did not laugh this time. He asked me if I thought she would have hurt him if he had kept talking to her, and I told him honestly that I did not know for certain, only that everything about my instincts that morning had told me not to let it happen. Brian tried to keep working the early shift after that, but something in him had changed. He started arriving late, jumpy at small sounds, asking to trade shifts whenever another worker was willing. Within 3 weeks, he told Rowan he was done, that he had a cousin in Spokane who could get him work at a warehouse, and he left without much of a goodbye beyond a short phone call to me the night before he drove out of Garrity County for good. "I keep thinking about her shoes," Brian said on that call, and I did not ask him what he meant, because he did not offer to explain it, and something in his voice told me he needed to leave that thought behind rather than pick it back up. I asked Rowan about her directly not long after Brian left, because out of everything I had encountered by then, she was the one that unsettled me the most, more than the sound of stools snapping in an empty room. "She's the one I worry about most," Rowan admitted over the phone. "Henley's predictable if you treat him right. The other one, the one with the eyes, he only comes when you're alone, and the freezer's always worked. Her, I've never fully understood what triggers when she decides to talk to somebody instead of just walking through. All I know for certain is that nobody who's ever answered her has come back the same, and one of them never came back at all." I did not ask him who that had been. Some answers, by then, I had learned not to ask for directly, because Rowan's silences told me enough on their own. Winter set in fully after that, the kind of cold that turned the highway outside into a long gray ribbon most nights. Snowplows passing through every few hours to keep it clear enough for the occasional truck. Business slowed even further during those months, and there were entire shifts where I did not see another human face between midnight and sunrise, except my own reflection in the dark window glass. It was on one of those quiet nights, close to 1 in the morning, that I heard a soft knock against the front door glass, gentle, almost hesitant. I looked up from behind the counter and saw a child standing outside, no older than 7 or 8 by the look of them, wearing a light jacket that seemed thin for the weather, no adult anywhere in sight in the empty parking lot behind them. Every instinct I had ever developed in my life told me to get up immediately and open that door. You do not leave a child standing outside in freezing temperatures at 1 in the morning. That instinct fought directly against the 5th rule, the one Rowan had given me on my very first day. If a child comes to the diner after midnight, ignore them completely. Do not speak to them. Do not serve them. Do not acknowledge in any way that they are there. The child knocked again, softer this time, and a small voice came through the glass, muffled but clear enough to understand. "Mister, can you help me? I can't find my mom." I kept my eyes down on the counter in front of me, focusing on wiping a surface that was already clean, my hands moving in slow, deliberate circles, because I needed something to do that was not looking up. Every part of my chest felt tight, the specific kind of tight that comes from wanting badly to do the right thing, and knowing that in this particular case, the right thing looked exactly like the wrong thing. "Please," the small voice said again. "It's really cold out here." I did not answer. I did not look up. I kept wiping the same 6 inches of counter, breathing slow and even through my nose, reminding myself silently that Rowan would not have written that rule down if breaking it cost nothing at all. The voice came again a few minutes later, and this time something about it had shifted, the pitch dropping slightly, losing some of its earlier softness. "You're not even going to look at me." I still said nothing. My hands had gone still on the counter, and I made myself keep my eyes fixed on a coffee stain near the register instead of the door. There was a long silence after that, long enough that I started to believe it might be over. And then the voice came through the glass one final time, and what it said was not a question at all. It was a sentence I recognized, word for word, something I had said out loud only once in my life, back in Billings, to someone who mattered to me, on a night I still do not talk about with anyone. I'm not going to repeat what it said here. I will tell you that hearing my own words come back to me through that door, in a voice that no longer sounded like a child at all, was the closest I came in 8 months to breaking one of the rules purely out of shock, rather than compassion. My whole body wanted to turn toward the door, and I forced myself instead to stare at that coffee stain until my vision blurred slightly at the edges. After that, there was nothing. No more knocking, no more voice, just the low hum of the coffee machine and the sound of my own breathing evening back out. When I finally allowed myself to look up, several minutes later, the space outside the door was empty, no small footprints in the thin layer of snow that had gathered on the front step, nothing to suggest anyone had ever stood there at all. I called Callista the next afternoon, needing to talk to someone who would understand without needing the whole explanation from scratch. It knew something about me, I told her, something I never told anybody out here. "They do that sometimes," Callista said, her voice careful. "Rowan told me once that whatever they are, they pay attention. They learn things about the people who work here and they use it, especially the one that comes as a kid. I don't know how they know what they know. I just know the only thing that's ever worked is not answering, no matter what they say." I asked her if she had ever heard it say something personal to her. She was quiet long enough that I understood the answer without her needing to give it to me directly. "Everybody who's worked this shift long enough has a story like that," she finally said. "Mine's mine. Yours is yours. That's about as far as I've ever wanted to go with it." I did not push her further, the same way she had not pushed me. That was the first time I understood, really understood, that everyone who worked at Wayside Diner long enough was carrying something from before they arrived, something the rules seemed to know how to reach for exactly when it would hurt the most. The trouble that changed everything started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early spring, almost 11 months into my time at the diner, when Rowan called me sounding different than I had ever heard him before, his voice thinner, breath catching between words. "I'm at the hospital in Harlow," he said. "Chest pains this morning, bad enough my wife made me come in. They're keeping me overnight for tests." I asked him if he was all right, and he told me the doctors thought it was his heart. Nothing certain yet, but enough that he would not be at the diner that week. Then his voice sharpened, even through the exhaustion. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "It's the end of the month in 4 days. You and Callista need to close together that night, both of you, no matter what. I don't care if business is dead. I don't care if one of you thinks you can handle it alone to save the other one a trip out. Rule 4 exists because something happened before either of you worked here, and I'm not going to explain it to you over a hospital phone. Just promise me you'll both be there." I promised him, and I meant it completely in that moment. I want you to understand that when Callista made the choice she made 4 nights later, it was not because either of us had forgotten the rule or failed to take it seriously. It was because Callista, more than anyone else I ever met out there, had her own reasons for wanting a little more money than an ordinary night could bring her. Callista had been saving for almost a year to move to Seattle, where her older sister lived, a plan she had mentioned to me more than once during slow shifts, usually with the kind of hope in her voice that made it clear how much she wanted to leave Garrity County behind. The last night of the month always brought more truckers through than usual, drivers pushing to make quotas before their companies closed the books, which meant better tips than any other night of the month. "We close early like always together, and I'll drop you at your truck," Callista said to me that evening, as we both prepared for the closing shift Rowan had insisted on. "But I want to come back after and keep the counter open another few hours for the truck traffic. I've done overnight solo shifts before, Kale. Rowan's rule is about not being here at all that night. I'll technically be here, just later." I told her that was not what Rowan meant, that the rule was about not being alone during that particular closing. Full stop, regardless of when in the night it happened. Callista pushed back, telling me she had worked there 2 years longer than I had, that she understood the rhythms of these rules better than I did, and that a few extra hours after a proper closing was different from what the rule was actually protecting against. I want to be honest with you here, because I have spent a long time turning this moment over in my head since. I did not agree with her plan, and I told her so more than once that night. But I also did not stop her, and I did not call Rowan from the hospital to make him weigh in directly, because some tired, worn-down part of me told myself that Callista knew this place better than I did, and that she had earned the right to make her own decision about it. I left around 11 that night after we closed the register together, exactly the way Rowan had asked, and Callista told me she would see me the next evening. I did not think, driving back to my motel room that night, that I was looking at the last ordinary conversation I would ever have with her. I came back the following evening for my usual shift, a little before 10, and something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. Callista's gray Civic was still parked in the lot, exactly where it had been the night before, covered now in a light layer of morning dew that told me it had not moved in many hours. The diner lights were on inside, visible even from the parking lot, though it was well past the hour any customer would reasonably still be there. I went in through the front door, the bell ringing the way it always did. And the dining room was empty. A cardigan I recognized as Callista's hung over the back of one of the stools. Her phone sat on the counter near the register, screen still lit with a half-finished text message to someone saved in her contacts as her sister's name, something about apartment listings, and a moving date she had been hoping to lock in. The coffee pot on the warmer had gone dark and bitter, clearly forgotten there for hours past when it should have been dumped and rinsed. The register drawer was closed, and when I checked it later with Rowan on the phone, every dollar was accounted for exactly to the cent. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing appeared to have been searched or disturbed. The front door had been left unlocked, which by itself told me she had never made it to the closing routine that Rule 4 was meant to protect. There was no blood, no broken furniture, no sign of any struggle at all. It looked, more than anything else, like Callista had simply stood up from behind that counter and walked out of her own life without taking a single thing with her, except that everything about the scene told a different story to anyone who knew her. I called the Garrity County Sheriff's Department that morning, and a deputy named Osgood came out within the hour, a heavy-set man in his 40s who took photographs of the dining room and asked me a long series of careful questions. He asked if Callista had any reason to want to leave town suddenly, and I told him honestly that she had been planning to move to Seattle eventually, which only seemed to support an early theory that she had simply taken the opportunity to leave without formalities. "Her phone's still here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Her car's still here. Her cardigan's still here. People don't skip town and leave everything behind." Deputy Osgood wrote something in his notebook and told me they would treat it as a missing persons case, that they would canvass the area, check her phone records, and reach out to her sister in Seattle to confirm she had not simply shown up there unannounced. I never told him about the rules, about Rule 4 specifically, because I understood by then that there was no way to say it out loud to someone outside this world without sounding like exactly the kind of person deputies stop believing halfway through a sentence. Rowan came home from the hospital 3 days later, weaker than before, and the first thing he did was drive out to the diner to see the scene for himself, even though the deputies had already finished their initial work there. He stood behind the counter for a long time without speaking, looking at the spot where her cardigan had hung, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a kind of exhaustion I had not heard in him before, even during his hospital stay. "I told her the same thing I told you," he said. "I told everyone the same thing. It's never enough on its own. People hear a rule, and their mind finds a way to make an exception for themselves, because they think their situation is different, or they think they understand the rule better than the person who wrote it." I told him what she had said to me, about how she felt she understood the rhythms of the place better than either of us, and Rowan nodded slowly, like he had heard some version of that reasoning before, possibly more than once in his life running that diner. The sheriff's department kept the file open for several months after that, following up on tips that led nowhere, checking bus stations and highway cameras across 3 counties, before eventually reclassifying the case as inactive due to lack of evidence. Callista's sister called Rowan a handful of times over that period, asking for any updates, and each time he told her honestly that there was nothing new to report. I carried the weight of that night for a long time afterward, turning over every point where I might have pushed harder, called Rowan directly from the hospital, physically stayed at the diner with her whether she wanted me there or not. I have made a kind of peace with it since then, though it took longer than I expected, and it did not come easily. Rowan hired 2 new workers over the following months to help fill the gap Callista's absence had left, though neither of them lasted particularly long. The first was a woman named Dawn, mid-20s, quiet and serious, who took the rules seriously from her very first shift without needing to be convinced the way Brian once had. About 6 weeks into her time there, she encountered the woman in the blue dress during an early morning shift much like the one Brian and I had faced together. Dawn handled it correctly, closing the diner immediately and locking up without incident. But something about standing that close to it left her shaken in a way she could not fully shake off afterward. She gave Rowan 2 weeks' notice not long after, telling him honestly that she needed a job that let her sleep through the night without her mind replaying an empty parking lot over and over. The second hire was a man named Easton, broad-shouldered, easygoing, who never once encountered any of the 5 rules directly during his time there. What eventually drove him off was something harder to name, the particular kind of tension that settles into a building where everyone who works there is quietly watching the clock and the windows at the same time, waiting for something that might never come on any given night but always might. Easton lasted about a month before telling Rowan the atmosphere alone was more than he had signed up for, even without ever seeing anything himself. By that point, almost a full year into my time at Wayside Diner, I had started to feel the same pull Easton described, a tiredness that had less to do with any single terrifying night, and more to do with the accumulated weight of every night that came before it. I told Rowan I would finish out 1 more month before moving on, enough time for him to find someone else to take over the position properly. The night I want to tell you about now was my last shift, and it did not go the way any of the previous close calls had gone. It was well past midnight, the highway outside fully dark and empty, when the bell over the door rang and Mr. Henley walked in, same as he had dozens of times before, same gray coat, same thin smile. I greeted him the way I always did, and he took his usual seat at the counter, and for a while it felt like any other visit from him. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I looked past Henley toward the front window to see a man standing just outside the glass, eyes catching the parking lot light the way they always did, utterly still. At nearly the same moment, I heard a soft knock at the side door near the kitchen, one I had never used before for customers, and a small voice came through it asking if anyone could help. 3 rules, 3 separate warnings, all happening within the same handful of minutes, something that had never occurred in the entire history Rowan had described to me. I did not know which direction to move first. My body wanted to run for the freezer. My training told me to stay perfectly still and ignore the voice at the side door. And Mr. Henley remained seated calmly at the counter as though nothing unusual was happening at all. It was Henley who moved first. He stood up slowly from his stool, walked past me without a word, and positioned himself directly between the counter where I stood and the front window where the man with the reflecting eyes waited outside. He did not look at me. He looked only outward, toward the glass, toward the voice still faintly asking for help at the side door. I do not know exactly how long the 3 of us, if you can call it that, remained like that, Henley standing as a kind of barrier, the man outside unmoving, the child's voice slowly fading into silence behind the kitchen. It might have been minutes. It might have been longer. At some point, without any sound I could point to, the man outside the window was simply gone, the parking lot empty again, and the knocking at the side door had stopped entirely. Mr. Henley turned back toward me then, and for the only time in all the months I had known him, he spoke more than a single line of small talk. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice quiet and even. "You won't need to worry about the 2 of them again, not on a night like this one." He walked toward the front door, same as he always did after finishing his coffee, except this time he had not ordered anything at all. He paused with his hand on the door, looked back at me once, and then stepped outside into the dark. I watched through the window as he crossed the parking lot, and by the time he reached the edge of the gravel, he was gone the way he always disappeared, without headlights, without the sound of an engine. He never came back after that night. I asked Rowan about it weeks later, once I had already left the job, and Rowan told me he had never seen Henley again either, not once, in all the months since. Neither of us ever learned why that particular night brought all 3 of them together at once, or why Henley chose to stand between me and the other 2 the way he did. Some things about that place I have come to accept were never meant to be understood completely, only respected. I left Wayside Diner for good 3 days after that, driving south out of Garrity County with everything I owned packed into the bed of my truck. Rowan shook my hand at the door before I left and told me he was grateful for every month I had given him, and that he hoped wherever I landed next would treat me kinder than the last year had. It has been 6 months now since I drove away from that stretch of Highway 87. I work days now at a truck stop diner outside a real city, one with other people around at all hours, streetlights on every corner, and neighbors close enough that I hear their televisions through the wall some nights. I sleep through most of those nights now, something I could not always say during my time in Harlow. I have started talking to my family again. Small conversations at first, nothing heavy, just enough to remind myself that Billings does not have to be something I carry entirely alone anymore. Rowan called me about a month ago, his voice sounding stronger than it had in the hospital, and mentioned almost in passing that he had heard through an old friend about another diner, several hundred miles from Harlow, that was apparently having trouble finding night staff willing to follow a particular set of house rules. He asked, half joking, if I wanted to drive out and lend a hand training whoever they eventually hired. I told him no, and I meant it fully. I told him I was done with rules like that, done standing in freezers waiting out silence, done keeping my eyes down on a counter while something outside asked me questions in a voice that knew far too much about me. Rowan laughed a little, said he understood completely, and wished me well before we hung up. I think about Wayside Diner sometimes, usually late at night when the highway outside my apartment goes quiet enough that I notice it. I think about Callista most of all, and about the last conversation we had before that final month closing, and about how much I wish I had argued with her harder that night instead of letting her decide alone. I have made my peace with what happened there, as much peace as a person can make with something that never got a proper answer. But if you ever find yourself driving a long, empty highway late at night, and you pass a diner sitting alone against the dark with nothing else around it for miles, you might want to keep driving, at least until morning.